The author leads the 8th chapter referring to Brock Lesnar and Frank Mir's bout at the 100th UFC event dated July 11th, 2009, generating 1.3 million pay-per-view buys, which is a shit ton of money because, if I'm not mistaken, the pay-per-view prices at that time were $39.95, if not more. So you do the math on that. Ticket sales alone for the event added another 5.1 million to the UFC's annual revenue. I've read further in the book, and UFC pay-per-view prices went up to like $59, $95, $60. It's crazy. Brock Lesnar won this fight, literally dominated Frank Mir the whole first round, then dominated him in the second round to the point where the referee had to stop the fight because it was getting bad. Frank Mir's face was a mess. Brock and Frank already fought before at the UFC's 81st event, in which Frank Mir won that fight by submission. Brock Lesnar was whooping on Frank Mir, moving very quickly for a big-ass dude and kicking ass, but Frank Mir is a martial artist, and he eventually put Lesnar in an ankle lock, which led Lesnar to tap out before Frank would eventually end up breaking Brock's leg. Lorenzo Fertitta's casinos were $6.4 billion in debt in 2008, and that's billions with a B, and the casinos were only making $1.3 billion a year in revenue in 2008. The debts came from large loans for purposes of funding new property construction projects, so they just weren't doing too good in that area that year. In 2001, Station Casinos took out a $165 million loan from bankers. In 2007, Station took another loan that was $3.4 billion to buy back all their stock in the company. Not sure where the other $3 billion worth of debt came from, but according to the book, by 2009, the Fertitta brothers were $6.6 billion in debt for Station's casinos. A company offered a reported $2.4 billion to buy all of Station's properties, but the Fertittas instead decided to file bankruptcy, leaving the company's future to the courts. It says that the Fertittas often relied on new loans and lines of credit to cover acquisition costs and build a property's growth. In 2007, the UFC paid $55 million altogether to its 200-plus roster of fighters. In 2006, Mickey's became the official malt liquor of the UFC, and in 2007, Giant Sports Drink became the UFC's biggest sponsor, signing a $32 million deal with Zuffa for advertising purposes. In 2008, Anheuser-Busch signed a 3-year deal with Zuffa to make Bud Light the official beer of the UFC. In 2009, Zuffa required all apparel brands to first pay Zuffa $50,000 before a fighter could advertise that company's brand or trademark on their person. They called it a brand affiliation fee for their fighter sponsor policy. Now it's all just Reebok. Well, maybe not right now, but in the future of After the 100th UFC event, in Brock Lesnar's post-fight interview, Brock got in trouble with Dana and Lorenzo for saying, and I quote, "I'm going home to drink a Coors Light, and that's Coors because Bud Light won't pay me anything," unquote. Dana was infuriated by this and confronted Lesnar in his locker room, which was followed by a public apology from Lesnar saying, and I quote, "I acted very unprofessionally after the fight. I screwed up and I apologize. I apologize to Bud Light. Bud Light. I apologize to Bud Light," unquote. He might not have said it like that, but on a different note, according to a report from the Los Angeles Review-Journal, Dana White had run up dinner bills of $15,000 at a restaurant called Nine Steakhouse and left tips as large as $10,000. Also tipped blackjack dealers at casinos as much as $100,000, with anonymous sources telling the Review-Journal, and I quote, "He's changed people's lives," unquote. Dana White saying, and I quote, "If you're excited to meet me, I'm excited to meet you," unquote. He told a CNBC documentary crew in Cologne, Germany, UFC also used exclusivity clauses with international television partners, which ensured that any network that wanted to air UFC events would agree to not broadcast any other martial arts promotions. The UFC Spike TV agreement expired in 2011. Kevin K says, and I quote, "We became the UFC channel," unquote. According to the book, after 2007, the UFC was outperforming every other major sport except the NFL. UFC's 105th pay-per-view event was was broadcasted live in more than 50 countries by 2012. The UFC was available in more than 1 billion homes worldwide. In 2010, Zuffa sold 10% of its ownership stake to a sports company called Flash Entertainment. The 134th UFC event was held in Brazil. In 2011, the tickets sold out in 74 minutes. There's a guy named Scott Coker who came out with a kickboxing promotion called Strikeforce in 1985 that would eventually go on to be a cage fighting promotion in 2006. The company debuted with a fight between Frank Shamrock and Nick Diaz's trainer, Cesar Gracie. Here's some shenanigans for you. In 2009, a company called Silicon Valley Sports and Entertainment bought 50% ownership of Strikeforce from Scott Coker. That same company bought full ownership and took over Elite Extreme Combat. Then, after that, the UFC bought out Strikeforce for $40 million. So, the UFC owns all of that, basically. One confusing thing I couldn't figure out was what Scott Coker did with his half of Strikeforce and how much he got from selling it. Because, according to the book, Scott Coker didn't want to sell Strikeforce to Zuffa, but Silicon Valley Entertainment sold their half to Zuffa anyway. Then, in 2013, Zuffa canceled out Strikeforce altogether, closing that company down. The UFC is basically like McDonald's buying out all ownership of Burger King's, In-N-Out Burger, and all the other burger fast food restaurant franchises to make one big super McDonald's fast food franchise. In the book and online, it says Silicon Valley sold their 50% ownership of Strikeforce to Zuffa for $40 million, but doesn't disclose how much Scott Coker sold his half for. But he definitely sold it to Zuffa since they shut it down in 2013. So the UFC bought out Pride, Affliction, International Fighting League, World Extreme Cage Fighting, Elite Extreme Combat, and Strikeforce, and wiped every single one of those companies out. Just another thing to throw out there, the cancellation of Strikeforce was mostly due to CBS terminating their contract that they had with Strikeforce because of a post-fight breakout in the cage on live television on CBS that was driven by Nick Diaz, who was cornering a teammate, and that teammate was Jake Shields. Since the Spike TV UFC deal expired in 2011, the UFC signed a $700 million deal with Fox Sports. In August 2011, Fox Sports would pay the $700 million over the course of 7 years. So after the deal, the UFC would account for 15% of Fox Sports weekly programming, including 646 hours a year on a channel called Fuel. Also, UFC events on FX, Fox Sports 1, Fox Sports 2, and the main Fox channel, including 2 seasons a year of The Ultimate Fighter. Lightweight champion Frankie Edgar says, and I quote, "We're up there with MLB, the NFL, we're mainstream, and I think it's just the tip of the iceberg. The opportunities are endless," unquote. And we're done.